If you ever watched Game of Thrones, then you probably remember Arya Stark. Interestingly, Arya is one of the examples of the ISTP personality. James Bond also made the list, among others. The ISTP or Virtuoso personality type is one of the most rational of the 16 personality types, and when they are religious, they can be very passionate about their beliefs. What makes them so religious though? Stay with us. In this video, we'll be doing a massive reveal as to why ISTPs tend to have such a personality. Before we get into the video, please remember to hit the subscribe button and click that bell icon. That way, you never miss out on any exciting content. Now, quite a number of people are religious because they were raised in religious homes. Others also feel that religion is a tradition and doesn't need to be broken. Still, others are religious, or rather pseudo-religious, to please the people in their lives. The fact is, ISTPs have a harder time understanding emotions and are therefore more logical. They tackle religion with the same logical approach they apply in other aspects of their lives. ISTPs interested in religion do a ton of research and find out factual information about their chosen religion. They don't just accept things, they go further and dig for convincing information and facts to back up their beliefs. And because they put in so much effort to actually find out information for themselves, they end up building a really strong faith in the process. That is why ISTPs are so religious. Now, religion and politics are more delicate topics that people tend to shy away from in a group. It's definitely a great idea to stick to mundane topics for the sake of peace. Virtuosos can be very unpredictable. Even though they can appear very dedicated to a school of thought for a while, they'd often have pent-up impulsive energy that can explode without warning, taking their interests in bold new directions. That is why ISTPs may suddenly turn religious after previously being non-religious. They are also very good at prioritizing, which means that they know how to use their time efficiently and how to save up their energy for the things that matter the most to them. ISTPs will devote as much time as needed to their religion and study. They are not going to be the kind of people who just worship on the chosen days and then promptly forget about everything for the rest of the week. They will prioritize their religion and set aside time to practice their religion. That can be through study, meditation, or any other form of worship central to their religion. As people who prioritize what matters most to them, the lengths to which virtuosos will go to practice their religion contribute to them being so religious. They are one of the few personality types that are very bold and practical in their approach to life. In fact, a hands-on approach is one good way to know if someone is an ISTP. They truly enjoy fixing things, especially when it is something that needs to be done manually. They like to apply theoretical knowledge in a practical manner. That means that they are the sort of people who will find practical ways to incorporate their religion into their lives. They're going to practice their religion in their daily lives, which is part of what makes them seem so religious. ISTPs don't just talk about their beliefs and forget them, and they leave them, all thanks to how practical they are in their everyday lives. ISTPs also have a strong desire to learn new things and explore, something very helpful for their personal growth. That means their religious beliefs, or lack thereof, are not set in stone, and they make time to learn more about things that they do not know concerning their religion. ISTPs approach their religion with an open mind and curiosity, a willingness to learn new things, and a willingness to change their minds and beliefs if they find something new that answers their questions logically. Virtuosos do not have strict boundaries, and they do not mind when other people barge into their projects provided that they do not interfere with their principles of freedom. Because of their laid-back attitude, virtuosos may also barge into other people's projects, even though they may not be welcome. However, that can be a contributing factor to how religious they are. Suppose an ISTP comes across someone undertaking a study or research concerning their religion. In that case, they are very likely to involve themselves and hence learn new things or gather more information. Intuitively, they immerse themselves in everything concerning their chosen religion, and it's not only their religion they treat that way. That is just how they lead their everyday lives. If we think that ISTPs are so religious, it is because they are. because they are some of the few people that will logically approach their worship and delve deeper into their religious practices and apply it in their everyday lives. So it becomes very obvious that they are religious and prioritize their religion when they're religious. We hope you enjoyed today's video. If you haven't already subscribed, kindly do so and hit that bell icon to avoid missing out on more exciting videos like this. Also, don't forget to share your thoughts with us in the comments section below.